How do you do? Here at Motley Views, we feel it would be a little unkind to present this review without a word of warning. We're about to unfold the story of Dr. Frankenstein and his monstrous creations. The makers of these films sought to create a movie that would adapt a play that was adapting a book. The story is ripped apart and sewn back together to make two films so changed from their original form that they are almost unrecognizable. It's one of the strangest tales ever told. I think it will thrill you. I think it will shock you. It may even horrify you. So if any of you feel you want to make a drinking game for every time I say, in the book, and subject your nerves to such a strain, now is your chance. We warned you. Hello, and welcome to my next episode of Motley Views. My name is Motley, and today I'll be discussing the films Frankenstein and The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, I'm talking about both films together because neither is complete without the other. They really are two parts of one larger story. They're directed by James Whale, based on a play by Peggy Webling, which is notable for naming the creature Frankenstein, which has kind of stuck ever since. And the play is based on Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. Starring Colin Clive as Dr. Henry Frankenstein, Boris Karloff as the creature, Mae Clarke and Valerie Hobson as Elizabeth, Ernest Thesiger as Dr. Pretorius, and Elsa Lancaster as Mary Shelley and the bride. Now for clarity, I'll be calling the Doctor, the creature, and the bride, so there's no confusion on who I'm talking about. They are all Frankensteins. I also want to preface this by saying that I love the book. It's probably my favorite novel of all time. I've read it many times. This is the third analysis I've done on the story. First, I wrote a book report in high school where I discussed what modern Prometheus meant and why technology can be bad in the wrong hands. Later, I wrote an essay for literature class in college where I discussed nature versus nurture and used the book's themes to back up my thesis. Both of those papers were focused on the books, whereas now I'll be focusing on the films. In 1931, Universal had huge success with the release of Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. So naturally, Frankenstein was quickly put into production. Both films were produced and distributed by Universal Pictures, and they spawned a number of sequels and spin-offs. It still has significant impact on pop culture today. Now, the film starts right where the horror actually begins in the book, digging up a dead body in a very creepy-looking graveyard. So we get no backstory for Dr. Frankenstein, no setting up his relationship with Elizabeth, no college years, and forget Captain Walton's trek to the North Pole, bookending the main story. Gone. Tone and mood were more important than character growth at the time of this movie came out, just as promised by the MC at the beginning of the film. Thrills, shock, and horror. Within 10 minutes, we get to the entire creation sequence, which is awesome. The sets designed by Kenneth Strickfaden are amazing. They're so good that Universal decided to keep them for other movies that were later used for The Bride of Frankenstein and decades later for The Young Frankenstein. And they are used to their fullest with cinematography by Arthur Edison. The cinematography is truly fantastic, especially for its time. You can tell that the camera is on a tripod by how still the shots are. Instead, lighting, shadows, and composition are used to create mood and suspense. So much care and attention is taken with arranging each scene that I understand why it has been emulated so many times in so many ways. Director James Wales would adapt it himself in his own sequel 4 years later. The plot is good, but if I had any issues, there would be some small details in the film that really deviated from the book. In the films, Dr. Frankenstein is middle-aged, wiser, and experienced. In the book, Victor Frankenstein is very young when he performs his experiment. His youth almost is excusable that he would perform these ghastly experiments without caution since he really doesn't understand the consequences of what could be. Oh, I can bring dead things back to life. Oh, but wait. Now I have a mouth to feed. Perhaps the films use the Doctor's older age to comment on how the hubris of man can lead to deadly consequences. I also didn't care for the normal versus abnormal brain plot point in the movie. It gives the excuse for the creature's horrible deeds. In the book, the creature is very intelligent. His evil deeds are more of a product of his environment. Keep in mind when watching this that in 1931, this would have been some people's very first movie they'd ever seen. So the introduction of the creature would be pretty killer to see. The jump cuts to close-up is very jarring. I would imagine been really effective to audiences back then. Movies with sound were only 4 years old at this point, and with that you'll notice there is no soundtrack music in the background except for the opening and closing credits. Or maybe you won't notice because so many other tools are used with great effect, like dialogue, on-set noises, added sound effects like lightning. The silence actually makes the movie more creepy and frightening at times, and it's very effective when the creature is being introduced in particular.
Sit down. Sit down. You see, it understands. Watch.
When watching the movie, you'll see that the screen almost looks like a square, a 4:3 aspect ratio. That was the standard until the 50s when TV became popular. It never bothered me once because so many shots have a verticality to them. I felt like I was actually getting more picture, not less. Many shots are filmed where the action is at the bottom of the screen, so when sitting in a movie theater viewing the big screen, people would look like they were life-sized, almost like you were watching it live on stage.
Oh, how lovely you look. But you shouldn't be here.
Every shot is a work of art, like a beautiful photograph come to life.
What's the matter?
And several inventive shots using a foreground, middle ground, and background, particularly in the middle at the climax of the first film. I suppose now is a good time to discuss Jack Pierce. Jack Pierce was the makeup artist for both films. Jack Pierce was a Hollywood Renaissance man as he was tried his hand at everything. Stuntman, actor, director, then makeup artist, and ultimately the head of Universal's makeup department. He used green grace paint on the creature's skin color as it would appear pale on black and white film. So that's probably the reason the iconic version of the character always appears to be green. It was meant to be a camera trick. Another thing to note was Jack Pierce created the makeup for the silent film The Man That Laughs, which is a huge inspiration for the Batman's Joker. So that means Jack Pierce is responsible for the look of Frankenstein's creature and the Joker. Mind blown. Now on to The Bride of Frankenstein, a better film in almost all regards. An excellent soundtrack by Franz Waxman has been added for the film. I can hear the theme in my head right now. Creepy, beautiful, and tragic, like the bride herself. I actually purchased the soundtrack when I listened to the whole thing for this review. I really dig the prologue scene. It mirrors the prologue in the book, where the origins of Frankenstein's story was famously created through a bet between Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, and their cuck Lord Byron during a long, dreary summer.
Oh, Mary, darling.
Astonishing creature.
I, Lord Byron?
Frightened of thunder, fearful of the dark, and yet you have written a tale that sent my blood into icy creeps. Look at her, Shelley. Can you believe that bland...
I remember the first time I saw this, which was years after I'd fallen in love with the book. I was impressed that it was included, and that they used it to recap the last movie. That was so clever. And casting Elsa Lanchester as Mary Shelley? So good. I immediately knew that this movie was going to be bigger and better than the first one.
It will be published, I think.
Then, darling, you will have much to answer for.
The publishers did not see that my purpose was to write a moral lesson. The punishment that befell a mortal man who dared to emulate God.
The Bride picks up right where the first one left off, at the burning of the mill, which I feel is kind of a bad decision by the dumb mob. That's really going to hurt the community. Guess we aren't eating bread anymore. Dr. Frankenstein is so dramatic in these films. Nobody talks the way he does. He talks like he's overacting all the time.
Formula for life. Think of the power to create a man. And I did. I did it. I created a man. And who knows, in time I could have trained him to...
I do like Elizabeth's speech about halfway through the film, but she also gets a little dramatic too.
Henry, don't say those things. Don't think them. It's blasphemous and wicked. We are not meant to know those things.
It may be that I'm intended to know the secret of life. It may be part of the divine plan.
No, no. It's the devil that prompts you. It's death, not life, that is in it all, and at the end of it all.
It's likely a sign of the time. Victor Frankenstein in the book is pretty dramatic as well. So I guess it makes sense from that perspective, although I don't think it was intentional. But if you want to talk about scenery chewing, Dr. Pedorius, played by Ernest Thesiger. This character was created for the film and is not part of the book. He is the true antagonist of the film, the symbolic devil on Dr. Frankenstein's shoulder.
Tell him that Dr. Pretorius is here on a secret matter of grave importance and must see him alone tonight.
And he is outstanding in the part. The scene where he is showing Doctor his homunculi experiments is so neat.
Like love has her little surprises, as you shall see.
Good heavens, Doctor. What are these?
There is a pleasing variety about my exhibits. My first experiment was so lovely that we made her a queen.
The camera tricks were way ahead of their time. They must have stunned the audience seeing them in 1935.
Sharp.
Magic on the screen.
Then, of course, we had to have a king. Now he's so madly in love with her that we have to segregate them. Now.
The scene where Dr. Bedorius and the creature is really good as well. The scene is funny, sad, scary, and sweet all at once. I think it's scenes like this and why the film is such a classic.
Oh. I thought I was alone. Good evening.
In contrast to the first film, this one follows the book much more, which I really appreciate. Like what the creature does after his creation. Helps a girl from drowning and then gets shot for his efforts. Meeting a blind man in hopes for acceptance, only to be soon met with prejudice and fear. Ultimately, understanding his loneliness. And in turn, wanting and demanding a mate. All story beats from the original source material. But no mention of his brother William or his brother's nanny Justine, who are fairly important parts of the book. The last 20 minutes are so good. It all leads up to this, the creation of the Bride of Frankenstein. This creation scene is better than the original in every way. With the pyrotechnics alone, you can see how much better the quality is. Dutch angles!
It's coming up!
The bride's design is absolutely brilliant. She looks amazing in black and white. Elsa Lancaster is so memorable with her and her very limited time on camera. That's right, even though the film is called
The Bride of Frankenstein.
the actual bride is only in it for about 4 minutes. Yet the combination of her iconic hair, costume, along with her acting have cemented her as a character icon. She manages to be so expressive even with no lines. I've seen images of her in color, and she's got this ginger red hair with the white streaks. I don't like it. The black and white hair is symbolic to the contrast between her and the creature. Thankfully, pop culture embraces the black and white version because that's the version we see almost everywhere of her. And that hiss at the end? Creepy. I love it. This was the first time I've studied the films, which are masterpieces in themselves. While they take only bits and pieces of the story element from the source material, other things shine, like Boris Karloff's memorable performance, his creepy makeup, the beautiful static shots, and the amazing sets and scenery, the sublime music, the unforgettable design, the awesome costumes, all these separate individual elements that come together to become something more than the original. When you see the creature depicted in modern media, chances are he will look like Boris Karloff, and his name will be Frankenstein, and she will always be his bride, rather than how the characters are depicted in the book. According to Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual, Frankenstein's creature would be considered a flesh golem. Its description states, a flesh golem is a grisly assortment of humanoid body parts, stitched and bolted together into a muscular brute imbued with formidable strength. It has an aversion to fire and absorbs lightning into healing. Sounds about right. I also think this image is a better representation of how the creature looks in the book. If you like these films, then I highly recommend reading the book. And if you do that, then I highly recommend getting Bernie Wrightson's Frankenstein. Holy wow! Here is another example of someone adapting a piece of literature on their own way, and it becomes something more. I saw this for the first time in a library when I was young, and I went out and bought it immediately. And I still have that copy today. The illustrations look like they took months to complete, and as a boy, they really helped guide me through all the elevated language I was reading. I can't recommend this version enough. I'd also recommend seeing Young Frankenstein, directed by Mel Brooks. I watched this again during my analysis to see if there was anything to write about, And yes, I am very happy to say this movie gets better and better every time I see it. Some would say this movie is a spoof or a parody, but it's not really. It's more of a comedic sequel. It does borrow elements from the whole series, but this doctor makes entirely different choices, which makes for a much more interesting take on the story. I was very pleasantly surprised in watching this. Oh, and I know I said I didn't like the abnormal and normal brain in the original, but here it is so funny, especially the scene where the doctor is asking Igor about his mistake. I swear, Gene Wilder and Marty Feldman are about to break. I imagine in my cotton-filled head that Mel Brooks was probably furious of having to deal with these chuckleheads for hours trying to nail this very long take. I'm curious what take it was. It most definitely wasn't the first. This movie is so good, and it's also good for people that might have an aversion to seeing older films because there's much more recognizable actors and it's very funny. Lastly, I would recommend The Bride, released in 1985, directed by Frank Rodham, starring Jennifer Beal, Clancy Brown, and Sting. The movie was critically panned and a box office flop, but rewatching it now, it's really not a bad movie at all. It's a fun watch for what it is. It's a direct sequel to Bride of Frankenstein. The movie picks up right as the doctor is about to bring the bride to life. The whole sequence is an almost shot-for-shot recreation, only now in full color, and anyone into Kimbaku will love her resurrection scene. I like Jennifer Beal as the bride. She definitely looks the part. I only wish they had given her her trademark white widow's peaks in her hair, or something to allude to it. James Whale's 1931's Frankenstein and 1935's Bride of Frankenstein are masterpieces in filmmaking. So many camera tricks that modern audiences take for granted. They look like magic in 1931. The makeup, the costumes, the sets, the scenery, the overall tone are so perfect that I don't even notice the film is in black and white. The high contrast of lights and darks help with the mood. They're meant to be seen this way.
When this dead hand moves, the monster created by a man they called Mad is turned loose to strike terror into the hearts of men. To shock women into uncontrolled hysteria. Elizabeth! To prey upon the innocence of children. This is the story you've heard about, talked about. The spine-tingling, blood-chilling story that stuns your emotions. Frankenstein.
So if you're looking for a classic horror sci-fi film, watch this movie. If you're looking for a film that's a strong, stylish piece of Hollywood history, then watch this movie. If you want to see the origins of the tall, green-skinned, flat-head monster, then watch this movie. Again. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Motley, and you're watching Motley Views. Bye.